Hey, I'm John,
And I'm Josh.
and this is Dungeon Brew, where we talk about all things homebrew.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
All right, let's dive into homebrewing and what homebrewing is. Because I imagine for people that are first jumping into Dungeons and Dragons or any tabletop role-playing game, they may not really understand the language of homebrew or why they would even incorporate that into their game. So when we're talking about homebrew, what does that mean to the new player?
Well, and I want to say also that, even beyond that, some people who have played Dungeons and Dragons have, especially with 5th edition, the sheer number of modules, the sheer number of full campaigns that come out where they spend there's a book, there's something to guide them. Sometimes it's difficult to imagine going beyond that or changing that. Sometimes it's difficult to imagine creating things or changing things beyond the official rule set. So yeah, there's a lot of ground I think to cover just in terms of why homebrew is important and how to implement it effectively in a game, especially when having conversations with your players about what it is that you want to add, what it is you want to take away, what it is that you want to change, and having that conversation with your players is important so that everybody understands why those changes are being made and beyond that into the world and a bunch of other stuff like that too.
So I think there's a lot of definition in what you were just saying there is that whenever you're talking about homebrew, you're meaning that you're adjusting, changing, or even inventing new guidelines around the story or the plot, around the rule set that you're utilizing, the setting that you're having the players engage in, etc., that may be different from core source that you may be picking up from Wizards of the Coast or someone else that is creating the
Yeah,
gaming
third
material
parties.
for you.
Yeah. The third party stuff is effectively homebrew. I mean, even technically, Wizards of the Coast stuff, they're making this stuff up. It's just
Hmm.
official because it comes with their logo. But
Hmm.
ultimately, what is occurring is they're making stuff up and they're putting it out there, and there's nothing to say that they're more qualified than the average dungeon master or game master to do that for their own games, especially when it comes to experience. And most experienced DMs, anybody who's been playing for a long time, understands how much homebrewing occurs. You can visit any Reddit subthread or post anywhere where people combine and just collect homebrew rules and all of the various things that they do. And there are simple homebrew rules that people like to implement where they say, I may always allow anybody who's dual wielding weapons to get their modifier to their offhand or something like that. It's a very simple change because it says something about the way that they feel like two weapon fighting should work.
Hmm.
Those are simple changes. Those are the type of things that you see on those where it's just a list of simple things that they do. But when it comes to complex homebrew, when it comes to implementing things like entirely new classes and making sure that they're balanced with existing classes, or creating multiple classes and making sure that those classes are balanced against each other, then you start getting into a different level of homebrew where you have to make sure that not only is if a player is playing one of those custom classes that they don't feel like they're either underpowered compared to the rest of the group or the rest of the group feels as though that homebrew class is overpowered, but also that it meets thematically with the rest of what's going on in that game, which I think for you specifically makes sense because in your current campaign that we're running, you are all of your classes are homebrewed, every single one of them.
Hmm.
I will say that I think the probably the least homebrewed is we have I think one of the original thief classes
Hmm.
that we stayed pretty true, and then one of the original barbarian classes we stayed pretty true. But even both of those we made tweaks to make them meet
Hmm.
thematically.
Yeah, which I find to be important in gameplay because I know we're probably going to talk about this a little bit later, but when you are homebrewing, like we have in the past with some of our games, is that you really have to tailor those homebrews as well to the players that are involved in the gameplay. And I know when I was tweaking some of those classes, there was a lot that went into it in terms of who are my players and what will they enjoy and what will help them be more immersed in the story by adjusting and tweaking some of these small things that they'll find enjoyable, which goes into a piece of that. But yeah, there's lots, back to your original point, lots of individuals, DMs, who have been playing role-playing games for a long period of time have the capacity to homebrew their own material. I mean, I'm trying to think of the websites that I've perused over the past that are just full of D&D materials that have been
Right.
tweaked for multiple different editions that have come out of Forgotten Realms or whatever the case may be. And a lot of them are free and accessible, but you see that a lot of folks dive into creating their own worlds and their own campaigns, their own adventures, their own classes, their own monsters, in order to add a flavor. Because I think for the most part, most gamers are also storytellers, especially those that
Right.
do role playing games.
Yeah, and storytelling is definitely a huge part of it. Homebrewing the campaigns, homebrewing adventures, that type of thing. And even though both you and I do, we're authors, we write, and we enjoy the storytelling aspect of it. I often find myself more bogged down in the details of homebrewing, um, different ways of changing how the currency system works in the game, or rebalancing the attacks or the damage, or how weapons work. There's a lot of the nuanced details of the game that I feel like tell their own story about the world you find yourself in. And that, I think, is important in order to establish the type of game you're running. So,
Hmm.
campaign aside, that's its story, that's its plot. You have an idea for this fantastic campaign for a story that you want to tell, that you want the players to experience. That all flies out the window if all of the you're running, you want to do this grim dark fantasy thing, and you're running around with high fantasy classes, high fantasy races. The idea of the multi-planar travel type situation where you got Gith Zerai and Gith Yongi flying in and out, and magical ships that are taking wizards places. There are differences, or there are avenues that you can take your game down by changing the way that your rules work and the way that some of those nuanced pieces fit together. And that in and of itself is its own storytelling.
I, I completely agree with you. Many of the mechanics that are built into fifth edition, I'm going to pick on fifth edition a little bit. They're forgiving mechanics. They're mechanics that
Right.
allow you to be a epic hero in a world that's really not that dangerous. And so not only have you put limitations on those forgiving mechanics, but you've also introduced mechanics that make the gameplay a little bit harsher to the character that impact the story overall.
So, really throwing me out on the tracks there, because I don't know that everyone would agree that fifth edition is forgiving. I think it is. I find that the way that death saves and that type of thing work, there's a lot of room for it, but it also has to do with the way that the DM chooses to implement those things. So,
Hmm.
you can have, because you and I have both used the injuries chart that I created,
Hmm.
and it is not for everyone. Not every player likes it, and definitely not every DM would like that type of thing in their game. That we've in terms of players that we've played with, not everybody's a fan. But the reason it's implemented is to add that fear, that the realism of when you go down, there's a good chance that you were injured in some way. But what I'm after with that is that the somebody going down in combat, right? That could be maximized in other ways. That could be maximized by, you've got an orc who takes down one of the fighters in combat, and instead of his next turn, the orc's next turn on the initiative, going and attacking somebody else, he could just stand there and stab the fighter in order to immediately cause 2 failed death saving throws. And so
I do that all the time.
Right, but then that is a means of death, and that's a means of achieving the grimdark type thing, right? Achieve a way of achieving realism. And it makes sense that the orc might do that, but it makes equal sense that the orc goes, there are still other threats on the battlefield that I need to deal with, and I'm going to go attack them. But
and this is one of the reasons too that I add in the critical chart when I gameplay, where there's a, if you critically hit on somebody, you then roll a d20 that has additional effects that can impact you in battle, whether your lung is punctured or your eye is gouged out or your teeth are shattered or whatever the case may be, because that adds, to me, more realism to the fight, and makes it impactful beyond that critical hit that you receive to continue to go round after round if you're not receiving the right type of attention.
Right, and I mean, and so I want to be clear here, because what we're talking about in terms of, because we've kind of focused here quite a bit on the injuries and the extra damages and the fear of going down in battle, all of those things. These fit a certain setting. These fit a certain style of play that is not necessarily replicated in rules as written. The DMG does have a section that is dedicated to doing darker fantasy style stuff, and that's actually the injury chart that you are talking about for critical hits. That's where that comes from. But in terms of like going down and taking damage or some of those other things, expanding on that, adding to that, and creating that system of rules allows for that to be part of the game. And there are different ways of achieving the same goals. Some of these are going to be mechanical things. Some of these things are going to just be through the delivery of the DM in terms of plot, in terms of how they express the story, express what's going on, what the characters are experiencing. Some of it has to do with character buy-in or player buy-in, when they're building their characters to fit the setting, when they are role-playing their characters to fit the setting. All of those things kind of compound on the same thing to fit the setting. When it comes to the mechanical aspects of it, that's kind of what the focus is there. And it's not necessary always to go to some of these extremes for, if you go down in battle or if you get criticaled on or whatever, then you lose the use of your right arm or you lose a foot or something like that. I don't use those rules in every game that I run. The current campaign we're running on Monday nights, I'm not, I have allowed you guys to have a way out of the injury chart. It's not guaranteed. It's a way to establish that, yes, there's still a danger of going down, and there is a cost if you do it, and you should avoid it. It's not something that, like you said, you don't go running, willy-nilly into battle with the assumption that you're just going to be okay. And I think that this is also something that occurs, it's changed across editions. In the older editions, if you're a thief, you start out with a D4 hit points, right? And you may roll a 2 on that at level 1. So we're talking about basic D&D. You roll a 2 at that at level 1, you have 2 hit points. You get hit once in a battle, you go down, you hit 0, you're dead. That's it. There is no death saving throw. There is no chance to be brought back unless, for some reason, your party comes across hundreds of gold in order to be able to resurrect you. And that is something that was, basic D&D. And as you fast forward through editions, you get into Death's Door mechanics, especially in, I think, late 2nd and 3rd edition. 3rd edition had that definitely, where it's like you go to -9 and be okay. 5th edition accomplished the same thing through death saving throws. And these are forgiving mechanics. There's not anything wrong with those mechanics. Those mechanics definitely speak to people who are more character-focused, more concerned about the well-being of their character, more concerned about being able to play long-term and not have their characters die. And it's not something that I wanted to necessarily get rid of, and it's something that I haven't implemented. Even when we went back and played our Beckme campaign, last year, I still had death door mechanics. I didn't get rid of that. I didn't want to kill off your characters just because of a bad roll, especially at low levels. That being said, there should be room for I'm not going to die, but I might be messed up. There might be permanent scars from my adventuring. There's a cost to adventuring. That's consistent in the games that I like to run, and consistent in the interests that I have when it comes to running those types of games. Those aren't necessarily for everyone. And
so I have a question for you, because I'm not sure, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not sure that I've experienced this in gameplay with you, or that you've introduced a mechanic along these lines. I know that they have certain pieces that are based around sanity rolls. In fact, I think you have in your lingering injuries a whole section for that we haven't really introduced. But you would think that certain things like having a companion fall in battle and get killed, or making a tactical error in judgment that determines the fate of a conflict, whether it's non-combative or is, and how that would impact the trajectory of like the character's journey and that type of thing, would impact sanity at some level for the characters. Is there a reason why you haven't kind of pushed that into your campaigns as a DM?
I have actually at one point. We used it specifically in the Khazar Karath campaign. You guys had to deal with a temple, and I'm struggling to recall, but you briefly entered into a Lovecraftian realm for a period of time, and we had rolls for sanity, and some of you guys actually had to roll on that chart. I think at one point one of my players had to roll, and he had multiple personalities for a short period of time. And then there were fear mechanics and a bunch of other things that went in there. And the chart is pretty widespread. It goes everything from having like auditory type hallucinations and compulsory noises that you have to make and that type of thing, all the way up through like cannibalism. So it's a pretty broad chart. Part of the reason I don't use that is, and I don't use it frequently, is because, again, it has to fit the setting. It has to fit the campaign that I want to run. And if I'm running a high fantasy campaign, I don't necessarily want all of the characters to all have some kind of PTSD or something like that, because it also just in using the injury chart, and they fit kind of in the same way. And this is something that different players respond differently to. If you have a player whose character loses a foot or loses a leg or becomes paralyzed, it changes that player's character, right? So it is, for some players, they view that as the DM stepping in and forcing a change on their character that they themselves did not want. When it comes to that, those are physical limitations, but the player can still get around and say, but my character is still the same person. They still have the same bonds, flaws, all of that stuff. All of that stuff still fits together because my character is still who I imagine them to be, even if they're missing a foot, I get a wooden leg, and for the most part, they're the same just in that sense. When it comes to the psychological aspects of it, I'm suddenly reaching onto the character sheet and saying, your bonds are different, your flaws are different. There are changes to your character psychologically that make that character, from a role-playing perspective, in some way different. And I avoid doing that unless I have player buy-in for that type of thing, because it is a huge change, and it is something that everybody has to be comfortable with. Not only from the sense of, am I comfortable with the DM or in some way losing something specific about my character that I like on a personality, on a mental level, but also, am I comfortable trying to roleplay some kind of something on the sanity chart that can vary widely, and I may have personal connections with, because things like depression and anxiety and that type of thing also appear on that chart, and not everybody is comfortable having an open dialogue with those types of things in what's supposed to be a fun time session, I guess. So not everyone wants to go, I want to play this, my character had some kind of sanity break and suddenly they're depressed, and then you need to role play that in character, and it not only does it alter the character completely, but it also is something that not everybody is comfortable talking about, let alone trying to role play that. So
Yeah.
I like the chart, I like the idea of the chart, but there's definitely a time and place for it, and I don't know that I've necessarily found that place yet to implement it fully. That was a very long-winded answer for what you asked, but
I like that. I know we're probably running out of time for this segment here, but a couple of things. One, it kind of struck me as we were talking that I really kind of am leaning towards it, that idea or that concept of having a sanity level as its own life pool in
Right.
D&D where it's impacted. And I know that I captured this a little bit in my Bog Witch dungeon crawl, where you guys were just kind of dungeon delving, and you had both HP and sanity levels that were constantly under impact. And,
Right.
you know, if your sanity dropped too low, you had to go back to town and recuperate, then kind of go back into the dungeon as well, which that's been captured in a lot of games that have been out there as well, for just like dungeon crawl things, that you have a certain sanity level that you have to meet. And I haven't seen, I guess, sanity as a life pool played in our D&D sessions before, besides that, like in long-term campaign settings where sanity is there. But I think that your overall message with this is probably what needs to strike home the most, and that is that whatever adjustments you make in a homebrew session, whether it's impacting sanity, or looking at combat things, or lingering injuries, or changing any rules to the monsters, etc., you have to have character, or you have to have player buy-in.
Right.
That's the biggest piece, is whatever you're introducing, you have to understand your players. You have to have their buy-in, and it can't be something that's forced upon them, or you're going to have a no fun time.
Right.
It's going to be a regret to show up on your weekly session to play the game because you don't want to go through this shit again.
Right. Yeah. And I think the only system that jumps to mind that deals with sanity directly is Call of Cthulhu, which is also part of the reason in the Khazar Karath campaign I included it, because you guys went into a Lovecraftian realm, so it made sense thematically to include the sanity chart. But I also had forgiving rules for the sanity chart, where any of those were relatively short-lived. I don't think anybody got permanent anything when we did that, so that was a big piece of it. But yeah, player buy-in is a big deal, and it's always a two-way street for that type of thing. There are things that I include, and you know this because we've been playing together for decades. That what brings me into the game as a DM is being able to tweak with rules. What I enjoy more than anything else is just fiddling with the mechanics behind the screen to see what works and what fits and what makes sense. And that is, for me, even if I don't implement things, sometimes I just like to try stuff out and see what happens in real-time play and go, oh, no, that was a catastrophic failure. Or, wow, that worked better than I thought it would, or any combination therein. But that is the part for me that allows me to, gets me excited about DMing. You know, I woke up this morning and I spent 2 hours fiddling around with my piecemeal armor for 2nd edition. That's how I spend a lot of my free time, and that's what I spend time thinking about. And that's what I like to implement whenever I go into DMing. It's what makes it fun. So,
and honestly, your transparency and your openness with that as a DM is what makes it enjoyable to play underneath you as a DM. Because when you do throw a wrench in the gears and it does not go the way that it should go, you come out on that stage and go, guys, I done fucked up. That was a bad idea. I should not have implemented that rule. I've had to adjust this, or I'm going to adjust this next week to make it more fair. And you recognize how those mechanics need to be tweaked.
Yeah, I constantly, when it comes to mechanical stuff, I try to be the first one out the gates that says this does not work when it doesn't work. I don't stick to my guns on rules that are not fun and penalize the players or whatever. It's more important to make sure that everybody's having fun and that it works correctly, that we're establishing something that's usable, than it is for me to have my pride and go, no, that class is balanced even though it's out damaging the rest of the the players combined, or rest of the characters combined, or whatever it is. So yeah, I try really hard to make sure that stuff is balanced and fun for everyone. So
Judge and Brew.
Hey, thanks for hanging out with us today. Please check out some of the stuff we're doing. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, join us on our Discord, or go and watch us stream on Twitch, where we're at 4 or 5 days a week. All the links are down below. We look forward to hearing from you.
Judge and Brew.
Hey, everybody, welcome. This, no, we're not going to do that. Sorry.
no, we're not gonna.
Judge and